Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Quite a lot of events in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 are governed by chance. It's which awards you get, what their weather will be when a guest throws up, how quickly they want to leave, and so on and on and on. The game has balanced these chances quite well, but what if it wasn't balanced? What if every time that the dice rolled you got the unluckiest outcome possible? I made a custom version of RollerCoaster 2 where exactly that happens, and today we are gonna see if, despite all of that, it is still playable. The quickest answer is that no, it's not playable in any way. That is because when a guest spawns is determined by chance. Every game tick there is a very small chance that a guest is generated, so in this version that means we won't ever get any guests. Okay, that's boring, so we'll keep guest spawning the same, but only the natural guest generation. I did turn off that from advertising, essentially just banning ads in every scenario. As is tradition in this game, we start off with a merry-go-round, and before we have even finished building the queue line, it has already broken down. Yeah, that's gonna happen a lot. Every few seconds a ride has the ability to break down, and while the chance that this happens on the very first check after testing or opening the ride is about 0.00005%, it's not zero. And therefore, every ride will break down within a few seconds, over and over and over again. That's gonna really hamper the throughput of the ride, but in the few seconds they have in between breakdowns they should be able to at least process a few guests. The boat hire is immune to this, as the rowing boats cannot break down at all, so it will be quite useful in this scenario. The same goes for the maze, which is why I'm building a nice big custom one here. But then it starts to rain, and that will never stop. Every so often the weather changes, and I made it so that it always selects the worst possible weather that is available in the current month, meaning that it will always rain. And guests do not go on the maze or a boat hire in the rain, so they're useless. In RollerCoaster 2, guests that have an umbrella do have a 50% chance of going into the maze anyway, but that's a chance, so that too will never happen. And no, you cannot build scenery above these rides to shelter them. That doesn't work for the boat hire and the maze. And that's not because of bad luck or anything, it's just that they cannot be sheltered. By now you may have noticed that all the guests are walking quite slowly, which is also a feature of this bad luck version. There's actually quite a bit to talk about regarding the guests. Every scenario has a default happiness that the guests spawn with, and then there is a random modifier that ranges from -15 to +15. Obviously all of our guests will get the -15 modifier, but that's still not too bad as they're still reasonably happy. Their energy level is not so great though. In all scenarios, guests get a random value between 65 and 128 energy, so every guest always gets the minimum of 65. Considering the minimum possible energy value is 32 and the maximum is 128, this 65 is only about 34%, which is really quite low. The guests are also quite poor. There are always 4 possible money amounts that guests can spawn with, which in electric fields are 40, 50, 60 or 70 euros, so all these guests spawn with just 40. Once inside the park, they don't do much better. I have built a dodgems by now, so there are 2 sheltered rides that the guests can head for, except that they never will. You see, every so often there is a random chance that the guest picks a ride to head for, and you know what we do with random chances in this video. That means that the only way they can go on a ride is by randomly stumbling into the queue line. We should talk about that for a bit, as there is another thing that I did not change. When guests aren't heading for anything in particular, the pathfinding is governed purely by chance. That means that theoretically they could just never bump into anything and only walk in circles until they want to go home, as demonstrated here with the help of some no entry signs. I didn't do that for 2 reasons. The first is that this would be quite a lot more effort to program than all the other stuff. Most of this has just been changing a condition in an if statement to always be true or false, or for a random number to always be the highest or lowest possible, which is a lot easier than writing a new specialized pathfinding algorithm. The second reason is that this too would render the game pretty much unplayable and wouldn't make for an interesting video. If your park consists of one long straight path with some queue lines on it, then you might be able to make something work, but as soon as the first path loop appears you would be screwed. There is one point where I could simply change something to always be false though. When arriving at the junction with a dead end, there is a 97% chance that they will not consider that dead end when choosing a random direction, but of course I made that a 0% chance. This vastly increases the chance that they will walk into things like right exit path or the various dead ends that exist in electric fields. Usually no entry signs are not necessary for simple exit paths, as 97% of the time they are ignored anyway, but in this version these signs will be your best friend. This random wandering has led to a bunch of guests entering the queue line of the merry-go-round, but they haven't boarded it yet. I guess it still hasn't completed the previous run yet from before the guests were there, as all the constant breakdowns make that take forever. I do already notice a few guests in the dodgems though, as that one cannot start until all the seats are filled, so is immediately ready to board. Let's build a roller coaster. It's probably not gonna be particularly useful, but I do want to build one anyway. It's just a simple junior coaster design with a fatal flaw that I'm not gonna notice until later. And of course, as soon as we open it, it immediately breaks down just like all the other rides do. To make it function at least a little bit, this ride will also get its own dedicated mechanic who is never more than a single tile away. It's gonna take quite a few breaking and fixing cycles to get past the chain lift, but eventually it will finish testing and get its stats calculated. Because we have such bad luck, our rides also get the worst breakdown possible every single time. On roller coasters, this is always a brakes failure, if it can get that, but unfortunately the bad luck of constant breakdowns prevent us from ever getting the bad luck of a brakes failure. Unlike in the first game, in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 you can only get a brakes failure if the ride is at least 2 years old and has below 50% reliability. That first condition will of course be true after 2 years, even if that is after the deadline for electric fields, but these rides will never go below that 50% reliability threshold. Getting fixed after a breakdown does increase the reliability, and thus the constant breaking down means that no ride ever goes below 98% reliability. The second worst breakdown is the safety cutout, which can also lead to crashes, so any rides that have it available, which is almost all of them, will constantly get that one. Because the boat hire cannot break down, I decided to build another one to attract more guests. You see, rides only attract guests if they are not currently broken down, so the soft guest cap is going to be really low despite all the rides that we have, and we need it to be higher as advertising doesn't work. Unfortunately, the swan boats that I picked for this can break down, but this is one of the few ride types that only has the vehicle breakdown available, so even though it is already selected to break down, it won't do that yet until the broken vehicle is about to depart. I think we should add some flower beds to this park to cheer up the guests from the constant rain. One advantage of that is that flowers will never go dead, as rain will water them. Another advantage of the rain is that you can always sell $20 umbrellas, and during our first few months this is our primary source of income, as we make more from umbrellas than ride ticket sales. It was at this point that I noticed that my junior coaster never made it back to the station because I made the hill too high. Yeah, if I build stuff like this, then the constant breakdowns barely even matter, as no one can ride it anyway. Let's fix it and then go through the slow, agonizing process of testing it once again. I'm also building a few one-tile death mazes to attract some more guests. As long as it rains, no one will ever go in them, but they will still come to the park for it. And you know what, why not another entire row of mazes? We gotta attract them guests somehow, and our very low income is very thankful for how cheap these mazes are. At the start of June, I noticed something odd. The merry-go-round still hasn't had a single guest ride it. There's a bunch of them in the queue line, but no one has gone on it yet. That is strange, as surely the test run doesn't take that long, even with the constant breakdowns. It wasn't until even later that I discovered that I was right and there's something else going on here. When one of these rides breaks down while ready for the guests to board, they seem to first do an empty run again before allowing guests on. Look, right now it's at the end of its 9 rotations and it's slowing down. Then it stops, doesn't let any guests on, and then it just starts again. It's the same for the swinging ship and the junior coaster. They will never ever have a single guest riding them for this reason. Or at least that's what I thought until I did some more testing after the playthrough. Even when we force it to wait for a certain load, guests don't board and the merry-go-round just never goes again. That doesn't go for the junior coaster, that one will work, but since I didn't shelter it, that doesn't matter a lot anyway with the constant rain. I haven't got a clue why this is happening, but it definitely doesn't help us. The Dodgems is different since it cannot start without any guests, so that one has been making some money. And so I'll build some more of them. It is a sheltered ride that guests can actually go on, which is quite a rarity with how unlucky we are. The constant breakdown still means it's performing quite terribly, but that's better than not letting any guests on at all. For the first few months you can charge quite a lot for any ride, and with a ride ticket price of €6 there is still some profit there. In early July something remarkable happened. The weather is clearing up. For the first time in 4 months it doesn't rain and guests can now finally go on the boat hires and many mazes. This happens because Electric Fields has the warm climate, and that climate does not have any rainy weather available in July. That allows us to finally make some proper ride ticket profit with our mazes, but it also has another benefit. Guests will leave the park if they haven't ridden a ride yet after a few minutes, and with rides so often broken down that chance is quite high. When this function triggers, it will make the guests look for a ride to go on as one final desperate move, but with most of them broken down at any time, there's a decent chance that they can't find any and go home. Having the guests ride at least one ride, which is happening a lot right now with the mazes, prevents this from happening. This drought also finally allows guests to experience the brilliant masterpiece of a bog standard maze that I built at the start, and this is where I was disappointed. You see, I had made another change, but because the guests are all quite tired, they won't do it. Except this one guest, who has had their energy increased enough to constantly jump all over the place. Every time a guest enters a new quarter tile in a maze, they have a chance to jump, and with our terrible luck, they just so happen to do that every single time, making mazes quite a terrible ride, as this guest will take absolutely forever to get anywhere in this maze. We are lucky though that our other bad luck that makes the guests spawn quite tired mostly prevents this from happening. If we open a different park where there are already a bunch of energized guests in a maze, we can see that it looks absolutely hilarious. It's like they have all turned into a spoink and must keep jumping or they die. Another thing that makes it harder for guests to go on rides here is that they always stop and watch rides if they can. Usually there's a 20% chance that they stop and watch an interesting ride and only a 6% chance to watch a slightly interesting ride, but now they stop to watch all of these all of the time, if they also fulfill the other requirements, and apparently the Dodgems are interesting enough to take a closer look at. This makes them stuck there for a while, not being able to ride any ride, which I think is a disadvantage for us. In August it goes back to raining and thus we go back to more Dodgems. There is one ride type that could solve all of our problems, and I have been researching gentle rides to see if we get it in Electric Fields. This ride is the Crooked House. It is so great because it is a sheltered ride that cannot break down, so both the rain and the breaking down have no effect on it. The lift would also work, but we don't have it and cannot research any new transport rides, so that one is definitely not available. On September 30th we researched the space rings and now there are no more gentle rides to be researched, so that means that we also don't get the Crooked House. We probably don't need it to beat Electric Fields though, as we're doing quite alright. The goal is to get at least 700 guests in 2 years, and we're already past 600 before the first year is over. I spent the second year mostly building more Dodgems and eventually we do start turning a profit. In April year 2 we did spend some money on new rides and still made €266 profit, and in May we even make nearly €1,000 of profit. When it briefly stops raining again in July year 2 we make over €4,000 from ride tickets, which is not bad. After July I mostly just fast forwarded to the deadline as we already have well over 700 guests in the park. But in the second half of August we suddenly start losing a bunch of them, and that is because it's overcrowded. That's usually already quite a bad thing, but here it's even worse. A tile is considered overcrowded if there are at least 10 guests walking on it, but when a guest encounters such a tile there's only a 1 in 3 chance that they will actually complain about it and lose happiness. But not here baby, here they lose 14 happiness every single time they encounter an overcrowded tile, making overcrowding a true death sentence. We could hire a whole bunch of entertainers to artificially inject some happiness into them, but alas that won't work. The happiness increase from entertainers happens when they stop and do a little dance or other animation, but how often that happens is governed by chance, and you know what that means? Entertainers will never dance and thus don't do anything. They don't work at all. That means we just have to deal with this since I'm too lazy to build more paths. The upside of so many guests leaving due to overcrowding is that quite quickly there no longer is any overcrowding. This happens soon enough that we stabilize with still over 700 guests, allowing us to beat the scenario quite handily. But that's only electric fields, which is quite simple. What about harder scenarios? Any scenario with the lift or crooked house available will do pretty well. Amity Airfield is a stereotypically hard scenario, but because we have the lift available it should not be too big of a deal. But let's also not celebrate too early, because Lady Luck might screw us over in other ways that we don't know. My idea is pretty simple. All we need to do is build a big massive array of lifts and we'll be fine. So I made a small custom lift design and started building my array. Of course it does start raining pretty quickly, but that's okay as the lift is a sheltered ride. We charge for the entry in this park instead of for the ride, so I'm charging €39 for it. Guests always spawn with a minimum of 45 and charging a bit less than that makes sure that they don't get below the money threshold for wanting to go home. Even though we're building plenty of lifts to attract plenty of guests, it takes quite a while for the guest generation to really get into gear. That is because in Amity Airfield the minimum happiness that guests can spawn with, and just will spawn with, is below the threshold for counting as a happy guest for the park rating, and the percentage of happy guests is a very significant part of that rating. Entertainers do not work, so the only option is to wait until they go on a ride and get happiness that way. In early April we do have enough happy guests, and as a result the park rating and thus guest generation have gone up significantly. While all these lifts are orange, which is one of the colors that counts as dazzling, we cannot get the award for the most dazzling color scheme. We do qualify, but getting that would require good luck, which is something we do not have. You can get an award at the start of every month, and how it works is that a random one that you don't already have is selected, and if you're eligible for it, you get it. I made it so that it only selects bad awards, and it only selects one at random that you're eligible for. It's not too hard to make sure that you don't qualify for any bad awards, so if you play it well, it really just amounts to awards not being there at all. That's a shame, because awards do make guests spawn quicker, or at least positive ones do. Negative awards make them spawn slower, so avoiding them is a good idea. Things are going quite well, and after just one of the 4 years we already have 1200 of the required 3000 guests, far ahead of schedule. However, I then noticed something that was quite annoying, and that is that there is puke on the path at the top of the lifts. This is annoying because having one handyman for every single lift is way too expensive, so for now I'm just going to go past all of them, manually dropping handyman number 3 there to clean it up. But also, how the hell does a lift make you puke? They have just 0.46 nausea. Even guests with a tolerance of none can't get more than 66 nausea from them, and that is under the absolute worst possible happiness and hunger conditions. But I guess if you do ride it over and over again, then eventually you will get sick enough to vomit, even if you only get about 30 or 40 nausea at a time. Also, while writing this section of the video, I just realized that due to our bad luck, all of our guests do have a nausea rating of none, which definitely doesn't help. And another thing which I did not forget about while playing is that our luck also makes it that as soon as a guest crosses the threshold where puking becomes possible, which is 128 out of 255 nausea, they will do so. And the same goes for throwing away litter on the ground. Donuts do not give any waste, but as soon as they have finished their drink they will throw the empty can onto the ground. In late year 2 we have 72 lifts, which I think is enough to beat Amity Airfield with, so I'm going to stop building and fast forward the rest of it. But not before I have assigned a handyman to the top of every single lift, so we don't have to worry about puke anymore. Takes a while to do that, but since we don't need to build anything anymore, we can now afford it, as it's now fine if we go into the negatives. Before that though, I decided that building bins to lighten the load on the ground-based janitors a bit would be a nice thing to do. These bins do always get full after the minimum of 2 items as opposed to the usual average of 21 items, so I'm not sure they're actually going to help all that much. A bit of fast forwarding later, in year 4 we have over 4000 guests and many hundreds complaining about overcrowding. Despite the constant happiness loss from that, people don't seem to be leaving the park at all. I guess they're riding the lifts frequently enough to prevent their happiness from dropping. The lift does have an advantage here, which is that they will ride it twice, once to the top and then back down again, and that also gives them the happiness boost from riding it 2 times. These 72 lifts and 60 stalls attract a total of 3,840 guests, so we're already well past the soft guest cap and are getting new guests quite slowly. Our total guest count is still increasing though, and at the end we have over 4,200 guests in the park with less than 60 that have ever left the park, which is incredible. Even with all the bad luck in the world, you can still build a very functional park if you have the right ride type available. But you know which scenario is gonna be extremely difficult? Extreme heights. When you open it, there are a few guests already in the park, which for this demonstration I will snap out of existence. Now, with 0 guests in the park troubling the experiment, let's see what happens if I fast forward. We never get more than 20 guests in the park at the same time. And we cannot blame that on Flaming Fury breaking down, as there are also 2 stalls that attract a combined 30 guests, so the guest generation speed is not the issue. Now, the problem is that everyone just leaves as soon as they walk in. How on earth are we ever gonna get to 4,500 guests with this happening? The reason this happens is that guests always spawn with that minimum energy of 65. Usually that is above the threshold for leaving the park, which is 55, but in parks with money disabled, like Extreme Heights, this threshold has been increased to 70. This is a big problem. On the very first check they are always below 70 energy, and with our luck that 5% chance to leave the park when this is the case turns into a 100% chance. So what can we do against this? Benches to make them sit down and gain energy will not help, as they don't sit down for being tired until they have reached 50 energy. The solution is queue lines. The only 2 ways of gaining energy are sitting down and being in a queue line, so if we can get guests to enter a queue line quickly enough and have them get the 5 energy they need to no longer be below the threshold, then we're golden. My idea for this is a go-kart, as their only available breakdown is a vehicle malfunction, meaning they only break down when they're departing or arriving, which is far less frequent than the constant breaking down of almost all other ride types. So I built a few sheltered go-karts and set it all going. The ones at the front are for the new guests and the other ones are to keep the guests that are already around occupied. But there is a problem, and that is that this ride makes the guests extremely unhappy. You see, in Extreme Heights they all prefer rides with at least 9 intensity and have an average or high nausea tolerance, which in our version is always the lowest of the 2, average, which for ride satisfaction purposes means 2 to 8 nausea. The 2.5 intensity and 0.4 nausea of the go-karts are well below the minimum for both of them. They will still go on the go-karts though, because if it rains they will ignore the intensity and nausea ratings of sheltered rides anyway and just go on them just to be dry. But that doesn't mean it's gonna make them happy, and they actually lose a massive 80 happiness going on a ride the first time and still lose at least 60 when going on their next go-karts. And that just kills everything and makes this definitely not work. If entertainers had any effect we could use those, but yeah, that's not an option. Okay, next idea. What about a good old queue line trap? This is where you put 2 no entry signs on the queue line with some TVs in between and trap an infinite amount of guests that are both queuing and walking around, making them stay happy forever. This too doesn't work. In theory it should, but somehow the very setup of the queue trap breaks in this bad luck version and eventually people start queuing normally, removing the infinite capacity. It turns out that this is caused by something that I thought did not have any effect. If guests have been queuing for a while, then every game tick there is a tiny chance that they think they have been queuing for ages. All that does is insert the thought of queuing for ages, which doesn't have any happiness effect or anything, so I thought that this didn't matter, but I made it happen every time anyway because I thought it was funny. Well, it turns out that it does do something. The insert thought function has a check where it sees if there is an action associated with that thought, and the queuing for ages thought has one, which is checking their watch. This means that after about 1.5 minutes of queuing, guests will stop moving and continuously check their watch over and over and over and over again. This is what causes the infinite queue to stop working, and I suddenly realized something else as well. This is what was causing the merry-go-round and other rides in electric fields to get stuck. That had nothing to do with the rides themselves, but rather with the fact that the guest in the front of the queue line, and all the others too, just kept checking their watch and refused to move. Usually they would leave the queue line a bit later, but I put TVs down, so they really are stuck there forever. I did put TVs for the first dodgems as well, but in order to improve the throughput as much as possible, I reduced the ride time to just 20 seconds, which is what made sure that guests never waited in line for too long. I never ever expected such a seemingly innocent change to have such disastrous consequences, but that just shows that I still don't fully understand how this game works. This is also a good point to acknowledge that what's happening here isn't actually possible in the real game, even if you do get the worst possible luck. The game only generates pseudo-random numbers, and while there are a ton of possibilities for it, the longest possible streak of bad luck is only so long, and it's probably far less long than what we have been dealing with so far. We do have to try something else to beat extreme heights though, so we'll try the other common guest trap. This is where you make the guests ride at least one ride and then trap them with a food stall and, if you feel generous, also a drink stall and toilets in order to make them never want to leave. If this trap is just a single tile of path, then they cannot complain about overcrowding, so their happiness will stay high. The go-kart disaster taught us that we do need to make the ride intense enough to prevent their happiness from plummeting, so here I've opted for a launched freefall with a flower bed on top to make it sheltered. The hot and dry climate means that it will be dry for 5 of the 8 months, which is nice, but having it sheltered is still better. Just like the dodgems of electric fields, this launched freefall has a very short ride time, so guests shouldn't be queuing for long enough to turn into a watch-checking statue. Now all we need to do is build enough other rides to get the soft guest cap to 4,500. Well, you can do it without that, but then it's gonna take absolutely forever. This is where the go-kart does make a return, as I realized that it's actually a great ride for increasing the soft guest cap in situations like this, even in normal games without permanent bad luck. I have often praised rides like the maze and boat hire for not being able to break down, but the go-kart cannot break down either if it never departs. That means that we don't need to bother with mechanics or bother with replacing any broken down ones, as they will never break down. It also has the advantage of looking quite satisfying with all the interlinked exit and entrance buildings. It has taken a little while, but in year 8 we do beat the goal of 4,500 guests. It took this long because not every guest was able to enter the launch freefall queue line in time, and more than half of the guests that ever entered the park have left. I'm not quite satisfied though, and I want to try to do it without trapping guests as well. That leads us to this setup with 244 launched freefalls in a massive grid. The idea is that once a guest has gone on at least one of them, they will hopefully stay around, but the problem is that new guests now have a far lower chance of going on the freefall. Without trapping the guests, there is no way to prevent guests that have already ridden it from riding the freefalls close to the entrance again and clogging up the space. And that's why this took a very long time to do, but eventually, after nearly 50 years and more than 66,000 guests, we finally managed to keep 4,500 of them in the park simultaneously. It's not easy, but it is still possible to beat scenarios without money if you have infinite bad luck. There are quite a few other aspects of the game that have changed that make the game harder, but they haven't come up too much as other more extreme things have taken precedence. One thing is that guests do have a chance to immediately head for the same ride again after riding it if they enjoyed it, but of course that doesn't happen here. They also need to be very happy in order to be able to buy a souvenir or use a cash machine, as that too has a random factor and this one involves happiness. Speaking of souvenirs, guests in this version never let go of their balloon. If they would do that, they would be able to buy a new one, which gives them some happiness and makes you some money, so naturally that cannot be allowed to ever happen. Spiral slides are also screwed if you for some reason use the unlimited rides per admission operating mode. Here's a little test in the normal game to see the difference between single ride and unlimited. In 1 year the single ride gets 663 riders and unlimited just 146. With the worst luck, the single admission is pretty much the same with 657 riders, that's just a bit of randomness, but if they can go unlimited, then guests will now always go to the maximum of 16 times, making it only get 39 riders in a full year. Not that you will ever notice this, as the constant rain, constant breaking down, and guests developing a nasty addiction to checking the time will ruin the spiral slide anyway. If you have a vandalism, vomit or litter issue in your park and it's bad enough, then guests have a chance to complain about it, which decreases their happiness. Not only is this chance now 100%, but the cooldown for when they can think this thought again is as short as possible, so you really want to make sure that your paths are well taken care of. And the final change, which is the worst of all, is that when ducks spawn, instead of the usual 2 to 5 ducks, it will always be only the minimum of 2. This has no impact on the gameplay, but it does make me very sad, which makes this a truly devastating, game-ruining change. Alright, while it has been fun faffing about trying to beat a version of the game that's trying to screw me over at every single opportunity, I'm also quite happy to leave it behind and return to normality again. If you did enjoy this and want to see more crazy challenges, you can click here to see what happens if the guests are all constantly sick all the time. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.